It is a cold afternoon in February 1917, and a woman in a white nurse's apron walks the corridors of the Alexandra Palace at Tsarskoye Selo. She has been awake for most of the night. 4 of her 5 children lie upstairs with measles, their faces flushed and their hair shorn against the fever. Her son, the boy whose secret has organized her every decision for 13 years, sleeps among them. Telegrams from her husband at army headquarters have grown shorter and stranger over the past 3 days. Outside Petrograd, 20 miles to the north, crowds are smashing bakery windows. She writes to him that evening. The disturbances in the capital, she tells the Tsar, are a hooligan movement, young people running about and shouting that they have no bread, simply to create excitement, along with workers who prevent others from working. If only the weather would turn very cold, she adds, then everyone would probably stay at home. By the time he reads the letter, the regiments meant to protect him will have already turned their rifles in the other direction. This is the story of how the most isolated woman in the Russian Empire wound up dismantling its government from her private chapel, and of how a marriage built on tenderness ended in the destruction of the Romanov dynasty. The story is not one of treason. Despite what generations of pamphleteers insisted, it is not one of sexual depravity in a peasant's bed. Something stranger and more disturbing happened. A sincere woman who loved her husband, her son, and her God believed, with the full force of her convictions, that compromise itself amounted to sin. Long before she answered to Alexandra Feodorovna, she answered to Alex, the 5th child of Grand Duke Ludwig IV of Hesse and Princess Alice of the United Kingdom. She had been born in Darmstadt in June 1872, to a household that still believed itself reasonably fortunate by the standards of minor German royalty. In December 1878, when she was 6 years old, diphtheria swept through the small ducal court of Hesse-Darmstadt. Her 4-year-old sister May died first. Then her mother, Princess Alice of the United Kingdom, who had been nursing the children herself. By the time the epidemic burned out, Alex had buried 2 members of her immediate family within 5 weeks, and her world had reorganized itself around an absence. Children process this kind of loss in ways that adults often miss. The little girl, whom relatives had nicknamed Sunny for her bright temperament, became, by every contemporary account, a watchful and withdrawn child. She mistrusted strangers and clung to a small circle of familiar adults. The trick that would later define her took shape, perhaps for the first time in those years, viewing the outside world as a hostile country whose inhabitants could not be trusted with the truth. Queen Victoria intervened from London with the bossy intensity that grandmothers of imperial dimensions tend to possess. She supervised Alex's education by correspondence, arranged her summer visits to Osborne and Balmoral, and impressed upon the orphaned girl a sense of moral seriousness that bordered on the absolute. Right was right, wrong was wrong. A monarch's duty came down from God, not from negotiation. The lessons were Lutheran in origin and Victorian in style, but they would map onto the doctrines of another church with surprising precision. She grew into an unusual beauty. Pale skin, reddish gold hair, the strong features of her German mother and her English line. Foreign princes noticed. So did a slight, mild-mannered Russian Cesarevich, whom she met for the first time at the wedding of her sister Ella to Grand Duke Sergei in 1884. Nicholas wrote in his diary, with the breathless punctuation of a young man who believes he has discovered geology in a teacup, that she struck him as wonderfully sweet. He decided then, at 16, that he would marry her or no one. It took 10 years to wear down the family's objections on both sides. Alexander III, the bull-necked giant who sat on the Russian throne, did not particularly want his heir to marry into the minor German court of Hesse. Alex herself refused, at first, to convert from Lutheranism. She wept for days at Coburg in 1894 before finally yielding, and when she yielded completely. Within months, Alexander III lay dead at 49. Nicholas was Tsar. Alex was empress. The Orthodox Church, which she had agonized over abandoning her faith for, had become the only true church in the only country that mattered. There is a particular kind of believer that converted faiths produce, and Alexandra became one of its sharpest examples. Cradle Orthodox believers in Russia inhabited their religion the way a person inhabits a house they were born in. They knew which floorboards creaked. Favorite saints, complicated relationships with priests, opinions about local customs concerning which icons brought rain and which fast days could be safely fudged. Cradle believers kept all of these and considered them perfectly compatible with sincere devotion. Their faith and their irritation with it could coexist at the same time. Alexandra came to Orthodoxy at 22 in a foreign palace, surrounded by women who whispered about her in a language she did not yet speak. What she found in the church bore no resemblance to a comfortable old house. She found a fortress. The mysticism, the icons, the elaborate physical rituals, the cult of holy elders called startsi, who appeared to act as conduits between God and ordinary believers. These never became background features of her new life. They formed its load-bearing structures. Historians sometimes describe her as inventing a uniquely paranoid form of autocratic ideology. That description misses the mark. The ideology she absorbed existed long before she arrived. Konstantin Pobedonostsev, the gaunt and reactionary procurator of the Holy Synod, had spent decades teaching Alexander III and a young Nicholas that any concession to liberalism, parliament, or popular sovereignty amounted to a betrayal of the divine compact between the Romanov and his people. Alexander III ruled by that conviction. Nicholas inherited the doctrine. What Alexandra did was take the doctrine and remove every escape hatch. If God had appointed Nicholas to rule, then any limitation on his authority became not just bad politics, it became sin against God. Recognizing the Duma's authority counted as sin in her catechism. Apologizing for autocratic acts counted as a worse one. Accepting a ministry responsible to anyone other than the Tsar belonged in the same category. She would write to him, in letter after letter over the years, that he must be sterner, harder, more like Peter, more like Ivan, more like the Romanovs of legend. The voice in his ear stayed tender and adoring, and when politics intruded, it sounded like a furnace. She did not socialize. The grand duchesses, the dowager empress's circle, the great salons of Petersburg, she avoided them. They reminded her of the foreignness she felt, and she suspected accurately that they laughed at her behind their fans. She built her world inward, around her husband, her daughters, the small clutch of palace intimates whom she could trust, and eventually, around a tragedy nobody was supposed to know about. Four daughters came in 9 years: Olga in 1895, Tatiana in 1897, Maria in 1899, Anastasia in 1901. The children proved healthy and intelligent. They were also, by the cold reckoning of Russian succession law, decisively the wrong sex for a dynasty that would not permit the throne to pass through any of them while a male Romanov drew breath. After Anastasia's birth, Alexandra slipped into a depression that her doctors recorded but politely refused to name. In 1902, she fell under the influence of a French mystic called Philippe Nizier Vachot, whose actual qualifications amounted to a butcher's apprenticeship and some hypnotism stage tricks, and who convinced her for several months that she was pregnant when she was not. When the real pregnancy finally came in 1904, and when the child arrived a boy, the celebrations in Petersburg ran genuine. Cannons fired, bells rang. Nicholas wrote in his diary of a great, never-to-be-forgotten day, the kind of day that imperial diaries record on the assumption that nothing important could ever go wrong on a day like this one. Within 6 weeks, the baby was bleeding from his navel, and the bleeding could not be stopped. Alexei had hemophilia B, a diagnosis that would be confirmed by DNA analysis in 2009, but which in 1904 the court physicians needed no laboratory to recognize. The disease had passed through Queen Victoria's line into half the royal houses of Europe, and Alexandra herself carried it. Her uncle Leopold had bled to death at 30. Friedrich, her brother, had died at 3 when he fell from a window and could not stop hemorrhaging. Her nephew, Henry of Prussia, would die the same way. The pattern was familiar, and so was the prognosis. The decision to keep the diagnosis a state secret came almost immediately. On balance, it would prove the most catastrophic public relations error of the late Romanov era, because the court was choosing to substitute one set of rumors for another that would have been kinder to its image. Consider what the public actually saw. The empress, who already struck Petersburg society as cold and foreign, now withdrew almost entirely from public life. Her son appeared at ceremonies pale and listless, sometimes carried by a sailor because he could not walk. Sometimes he did not appear at all. When the family vanished to Livadia or Spala for months at a time, the rumors filled the vacuum that the boy was mentally defective, that the empress was unstable, that she had taken up with mystics because the Tsar no longer loved her. None of those rumors was true. The secret being kept was simpler and far more pitiful. A more confident court might have made the disease public. A bleeding heir would have drawn sympathy, and the parents would have looked like parents instead of strangers. Alexandra believed, however, that any sign of weakness in the dynasty would be exploited by its enemies, and Nicholas, who had never possessed his wife's iron will on any subject, deferred to her. The silence held, and the rumors grew. Into that silence, in November 1905, walked a Siberian peasant with a black beard and pale, slightly hypnotic eyes. It is worth establishing, before going any further, what Grigory Rasputin actually was and was not. The tabloid version has dominated his legend for a century. The tabloid version is wrong in several specific ways that the surviving record of his life, his theology, and his death allows us to set straight with reasonable confidence. He had never been a monk and had never taken orders. The word Kleist, which his enemies threw at him to suggest he belonged to a banned sexual sect, was probably untrue, although his theology was unconventional enough that Orthodox bishops periodically launched investigations into him. By his own description, he lived as a strannik, a wandering pilgrim, the kind of folk religious figure that pre-revolutionary Russia produced in quantity. He drank, and he womanized in Petersburg's restaurants and salons with a directness that scandalized the press. A wife and 3 children waited back in the village of Pokrovskoye, whom he visited occasionally and otherwise ignored. He also appears to have possessed, by every contemporary account that bothered to record it, an unusual personal magnetism and a sincere, if unorthodox, spirituality. People who hated him on principle reported being disarmed in his presence. Those who loved him described a kind of charged certainty about him. None of this would have mattered if he had remained in the salons of the curious aristocracy, where he had been making his rounds since around 1903. What mattered was that in 1905, 2 Montenegrin princesses introduced him to the empress. Anastasia and Militsa, both married into the Romanov family, collected mystics the way other women collected porcelain. They had imported the Frenchman Philippe a few years earlier, and they produced Rasputin now. Alexandra met him, and at some point in the next 2 years, the boy's bleeding episodes began to respond to the strannik's presence in ways that nobody could explain. The modern medical theory, advanced by Robert Massey and others, holds that Rasputin's most useful intervention may have been a negative one. He dismissed the doctors, which meant he dismissed the aspirin they had begun prescribing in 1899 as a wonder drug. Aspirin is a blood thinner. For a hemophiliac, removing aspirin from the prescription regime would have produced what looked, to a desperate mother, like a miracle. Hypnotic suggestion may have helped lower the boy's blood pressure during episodes. The peasant's calm itself may have contributed by reducing the household panic that exacerbated bleeding. Alexandra cared nothing for these explanations. She had watched her son die in slow installments for years. A man arrived who could stop it, and the man told her he had been sent by God, and she took him at his word, completely, and for the next 11 years, she never reconsidered her judgment about him, no matter how dark the evidence against him grew. In her letters to Nicholas, She called him our friend. She referred to his opinions as if they arrived from heaven. When ministers and bishops and grand dukes warned her that the Stranic passed as a fraud, a drunk, a sexual predator, a disgrace to the church, she heard only one thing. The enemies of the autocracy were trying to take away the man who kept her son alive. The two ideas, in her mind, fused. To attack Rasputin meant attacking Alexei. An attack on Alexei threatened the dynasty. Anything that threatened the dynasty defied the will of God. It would have taken a saint to think clearly about any of this, and Alexandra, despite her sincere efforts in that direction, never qualified. The tabloid version of the Empress and the Peasant has proved so durable that it deserves a direct rebuttal. The durable lies were used as political weapons by people who knew better, and they continue to circulate in popular accounts a century later. Two contemporary investigations make the actual record clear. In 1917, after the February Revolution, the provisional government impaneled the Muraviev Commission to investigate the crimes of the fallen regime. Its members held no friendliness toward the Romanovs. Several were lawyers associated with the cadets and the moderate left who had spent their entire careers being harassed by the imperial police, and they had every motivation to find compromising material on Alexandra. The commissioners subpoenaed servants, combed through letters, and interviewed members of the household. They produced nothing. In 1919, the White General Anton Denikin authorized a separate investigation by the magistrate Nikolai Sokolov. This one focused on the Romanovs' murder. Sokolov leaned monarchist by temperament. He, too, had every reason to want a clean record for the family he was eulogizing, but he also examined the question of Rasputin's relationship with the court. His findings matched Muraviev's. No evidence of any sexual relationship surfaced. The case of Anna Virubova may be the most pitiful. Virubova, Alexandra's closest friend and lady-in-waiting, was widely depicted in the popular press as the bisexual third wheel in a Romanov-Rasputin sexual triangle. After the revolution, the provisional government had her medically examined by Dr. Ivan Mnuchin. She turned 33 that year, and the examination concluded with embarrassed clinical precision, remained a virgin. Her 1907 marriage had proved so disastrous that the union had never been consummated. She had spent the years since as Alexandra's friend and as Rasputin's devotee, in that order, and the rumors that had ruined her in print held no basis in her body. This matters because the rumors mattered. The whispering campaign that turned the Empress into a German whore who shared her bed with a peasant produced real political consequences. It demolished the moral authority that Russian monarchy depended on. The actual relationship, the real, documented relationship in the letters and diaries, would have struck the rumor-mongers as insufficiently lurid. It existed as the relationship of a frightened mother to a man she believed God had sent to save her child, and the relationship of a sincerely religious woman to a peasant whom she believed represented the unmediated voice of the Russian land itself. No sex took place. What did happen proved stranger and, politically, far more damaging. Alexandra held an idea about Russia that was wrong in an interesting way. She believed that the real Russia, the eternal Russia, did not live in the Duma chambers or the Petersburg salons or the universities or the editorial offices of liberal newspapers. Real Russia lived in the villages. It lived in the peasants who attended the Orthodox liturgy without questioning it, who prostrated themselves before icons, who wept when the Tsar's carriage passed by and treated him as the little father appointed by God. The educated classes, in her view, formed a thin layer of foreign poison floating on top of an ocean of authentic Russian devotion. They produced noise. Peasants produced loyalty. Allegiance flowed from Tsar to villager and back, not to the noisy critics. There was one problem with this analysis. The peasants, she imagined, existed largely as a figment of her imagination, and Rasputin, with his drinking and his salon scandals and his murky theology, did not represent them or the patient devotional masses she pictured behind him. Russia, in 1905, had already begun detonating. The countryside had been seething for 40 years under the unresolved tensions of the emancipation of the serfs, which had freed them legally and then loaded them with redemption payments that strangled village economies. The 1905 revolution that nearly destroyed the dynasty had seen peasant uprisings in nearly every province. By 1917, peasant land hunger would become the most explosive single force in the Russian Revolution, and the peasants would not be marching to defend their little father. They would burn manor houses. Alexandra never quite saw this. When the Duma criticized her or the court, she could dismiss the criticism as the noise of the educated classes against the will of the real Russia, the will that spoke through her peasant friend. The argument ran in a circle, and the circle stayed airtight. Considered as policy, it amounted to self-destruction. For the first year of the First World War, Nicholas tried to govern from Petrograd. His uncle, the towering Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, commanded the army from the front. The arrangement performed badly, but not catastrophically. The Russian armies retreated from Poland and Galicia under massive German pressure in the summer of 1915, and the front-line generals begged for political stability behind the lines. What they received instead was the Tsar's announcement that he would take personal command of the armies himself. The decision belonged to Nicholas. Alexandra, however, in a series of letters that survive, had been lobbying for it for months. Her reasoning ran twofold and characteristic. First, Nikolai Nikolaevich had grown too popular and might emerge from the war as a rival to the throne. Second, taking command would let Nicholas become the Tsar his ancestors had been, mystically connected to his soldiers, sharing their sacrifices, fulfilling his divine commission as the father of his people. The Council of Ministers begged him not to do it. 8 of the 13 ministers signed a joint letter warning that he could not be Tsar and Supreme Commander simultaneously, that the conduct of the war had grown too complex for one man, that his absence from the capital during a wartime political crisis would leave a vacuum. He did it anyway. He departed for Mogilev to live at army headquarters, and the vacuum in the capital filled itself with his wife. The next 18 months would prove the most destructive of Alexandra's life, and arguably of the dynasties. With Nicholas 600 miles away at Mogilev and the long-distance telephone unreliable, the running of the empire fell, by default, to a woman who corresponded daily with her husband and weekly with a Siberian peasant. The combination would not survive contact with reality. Russian government in 1915 had already become an exhausted machine running on the wartime fumes of an inadequate pre-war bureaucracy that had been designed in the 19th century to administer an agrarian empire, not to fight a continental industrial war. What it could not survive was being constantly reshuffled. Alexandra reshuffled it constantly. Her letters to Nicholas, written daily and sometimes twice daily, returned with grinding repetition to the same theme, that the ministers were betraying him, that they were incompetent, and Duma loyal and hostile to our friend, and busy undermining the autocracy at every opportunity they could find. Names she wanted dismissed accumulated, and so did the names she wanted appointed. Alexei Polivanov, the Minister of War, had been brought in during the 1915 munitions crisis, precisely because of his competence. He worked with the Duma's War Industries Committee and with the Zemstvo unions organizing wartime production at the local level, and under his stewardship Russian artillery shells reached the front in quantities the country had never previously achieved. Alexandra detested him. He counted as an enemy of Rasputin, with ties to Alexander Guchkov, the Duma's Octobrist leader, whom she viewed as a personal antagonist. Nicholas harbored his own doubts about Polivanov, which Alexandra reinforced relentlessly. Polivanov was dismissed in March 1916. The pattern continued. Ivan Goromykin, an exhausted 76-year-old reactionary, retained the chairmanship of the Council of Ministers long past the point where his colleagues openly mocked him, because Alexandra trusted his autocratic principles. He gave way in 1916 to Boris Sturmer, a man of such limited ability that even monarchist memoirists struggled to find a kind word about him. Sturmer arrived equipped with Rasputin's recommendation and Alexandra's approval and nothing else. His German surname, which became a propaganda gift to the regime's enemies in the middle of a war against Germany, seemed not to occur to anyone at Tsarskoye Selo as a potential problem. The appointment of Alexander Protopopov as Minister of the Interior in September 1916 proved the most disastrous of all. Protopopov had previously held the deputy chairmanship of the Duma. He suffered, contemporaries believed, from syphilitic dementia in its early stages and claimed to have visions. His office made him directly responsible for managing both the police and the food supply of Petrograd in the winter of 1916-1917, which is to say, for managing the immediate physical conditions in which a revolution would or would not break out. The man proved completely incapable of either task. The cumulative effect produced what Russians at the time called the Ministerial leapfrog. 4 prime ministers in 2 years, 5 ministers of the interior in succession, 3 each for the foreign and war portfolios. The math was bleak. Each new minister inherited his predecessor's half-finished initiatives, lacked authority because everyone knew he would be replaced within months, and devoted his energies to managing his relationship with Alexandra and Rasputin rather than to administering his portfolio. All this unfolded during a total war. The Russian army was the largest army that had ever existed. Its supply chains, transport networks, munitions factories, and food procurement systems all required coordination at a level that the Russian state had never previously achieved. Instead, the state was being shuffled like a deck of cards by an empress in a private chapel who took dictation from a peasant. The other thing Alexandra was, in the public imagination, was German. She belonged to Germany in no meaningful political sense. She had grown up principally in England, considered herself English in her tastes, and had cut almost all contact with her Hessian relatives after her marriage. Her sympathy in the war lay entirely with Russia, and her brother Ernie's tentative peace feelers in 1916 went nowhere with her or with Nicholas. The treason charge that would dog her for the rest of her life carried no factual content. It also did not need any. A nation that had been losing battles for 2 years, that watched its young men disappear into the Galician mud at a rate that beggared imagination, that faced bread shortages in its capital and a collapsing railway system, needed an explanation. Bad luck would not do as an explanation, and strategic miscalculation felt insufficient. Treason fit perfectly. The German woman in the palace, with her peasant advisor, her German surname on her prime minister, her constant interference with the army's logistical chiefs. The picture made narrative sense, even when it did not make factual sense. Paul Milyukov, the leader of the Cadet Party, delivered the most devastating speech of his career in the Duma on November 1, 1916. He listed the regime's failures, one after another. After each, he asked the chamber, "Is this stupidity or is this treason?" The phrase became the title under which the speech circulated, mimeographed and passed hand to hand across the country, including to the front lines where soldiers read it by candlelight in dugouts. Milyukov did not need to name Alexandra explicitly. Everyone knew whom he meant. The genius of the speech lay in how it converted the regime's actual failures, which were the failures of a deteriorating bureaucracy under autocratic stress, into evidence of conspiracy. Alexandra's interference with ministers turned into proof of pro-German sabotage. Rasputin's influence turned into proof of a foreign cabal. The fact that none of this was true, that the misery being inflicted on Russia was the product of incompetence rather than malice, did not register. Once a regime has lost its moral authority, every misfortune confirms the worst suspicions. She, meanwhile, had spent the war as a working nurse. With her 2 eldest daughters, she had trained as a surgical assistant under Dr. Vera Gedroitz at the Catherine Palace Hospital, where wounded officers came for treatment. Olga and Tatiana, now 19 and 17, scrubbed in. Alexandra herself assisted in operations, held men's hands while their legs came off, wrote condolence letters to families of the dead, and visited the dying to pray with them and dress their wounds. The work proved real and hard, and almost no one in Russia outside the hospital walls knew or believed it. Within the palace, she remained a mother nursing her son and her country's wounded. Within the country, she became the gap between the 2 images grew impossible to close, and the official press, which might have closed it by publicizing her hospital work, stayed too dazed by Rasputin's growing power to think clearly about propaganda. By the autumn of 1916, the Romanov family itself had concluded that the dynasty stood in mortal danger, and that the danger came from inside the palace. The Grand Dukes and Grand Duchesses were not Bolsheviks. They were the most reactionary class in Europe, and they wanted, more than anything, to save the institution that justified their existence. What they recognized, with increasing clarity through 1915 and 1916, was that the institution could not be saved while Alexandra continued to dictate ministerial appointments from her boudoir. Grand Duke Nikolai Mikhailovich, a historian by inclination and one of the few intellectuals in the extended family, wrote a blunt letter to Nicholas in November 1916. He warned that the empress's influence was destroying the regime, that the ministers were being shuffled to her preferences rather than the country's needs, that the dynasty's future was being squandered. He read the letter aloud to the Tsar in person at Stavka. Nicholas listened politely, accepted the letter, and showed it to Alexandra at his next visit. She read it and reportedly snapped that the writer should be sent to Siberia. Nikolai Mikhailovich was banished from Petrograd instead. The Dowager Empress, Marie Feodorovna, who had loathed her daughter-in-law for 2 decades and now found vindication in everything she had ever said against her, made her own representations to Nicholas and was likewise ignored. Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna the Elder, the senior Grand Duchess at court and a woman of immense political weight, attempted to warn Alexandra directly. The door closed in her face. Princess Zinaida Yusupova, mother of the future assassin, undertook a similar mission with similar results. Felix Yusupov's memoirs, in which he dramatizes his mother's confrontation with the Empress, must be read with care. Because Yusupov was a vain man who reorganized history around himself. The broader pattern is confirmed elsewhere. Duma President Mikhail Rodyanko and other contemporaries describe the same political reality. The aristocracy of Petersburg, the families who had been the regime's natural allies for 2 centuries, fell into a state of open political insubordination by the end of 1916. They had concluded that Alexandra was killing them, that Rasputin had become Alexandra's umbilical cord to a fatal politics, and they had begun to think, in the worst tradition of Russian palace politics, about removal. On the night of December 16, 1916, Prince Felix Yusupov invited Rasputin to his palace on the Moika embankment in Petrograd for tea. What followed has been romanticized into one of the great Gothic spectacles of the 20th century, principally by Yusupov himself, whose memoirs presented him as a heroic patriot and Rasputin as a near-supernatural villain who refused to die. The actual murder unfolded as a sordid affair carried out by men who had no idea what they were doing. Yusupov and his accomplices poisoned the wine, which Rasputin drank with apparent unconcern, possibly because the poison had not been correctly prepared. They shot him in the back when he proved difficult to kill by chemistry, shot him again when he proved difficult to kill by a single bullet, wrapped his body in a curtain, drove it to a hole in the ice on the Malaya Nevka, and dumped it. An autopsy revealed that he had not, contrary to legend, drowned. He had bled to death from the gunshot wounds, before he reached the river. The murderers were Yusupov, Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, and the right-wing Duma member Vladimir Purishkevich, with 2 minor accomplices. None of them belonged to the revolutionary camp. Purishkevich had spent his entire political career as one of the most extreme monarchists in Russia. Dmitry Pavlovich came from the Romanovs by birth and the Guards officer corps by training. Yusupov was an extravagant aristocrat with an Oxford education and a transgender wardrobe who placed his own social position above all else. What they were attempting was not a revolution. It amounted to a court intervention of the 18th century variety. Kill the favorite, free the monarch from his bad influences, and save the dynasty. The model in their minds was probably Catherine the Great's coup against her husband Peter III, or perhaps the murder of Paul I in 1801 by Guards officers seeking to protect autocratic legitimacy from a mad ruler. They miscalculated badly. Killing Rasputin did not free Nicholas from Alexandra. It hardened her grief into rage, and her rage into a final embrace of the autocratic principle that had killed her friend. The burial took place at Tsarskoye Selo, where she could visit the grave. She wrote to Nicholas, urging him to punish the conspirators, including his own cousin, with the full severity of which Romanov autocracy was capable. Nicholas did not punish the conspirators with severity. He banished Dmitry Pavlovich to the Persian front, which inadvertently saved his life, since it removed him from Russia before the revolution. Yusupov he exiled to his estates. The conservatives in the Duma and the family were appalled at the leniency, and the conservatives in the country at large drew their conclusions about the Tsar's loyalties. The murder of Rasputin came as the last warning that the aristocracy could send before things broke apart entirely. The Grand Dukes and the right-wing Duma men had told Alexandra what they thought of her politics by killing the man she relied on. She had refused to hear them. Now nothing remained between the dynasty and what came next. The bread riots in Petrograd began on February 23, 1917, which fell on International Women's Day in the old Russian calendar. Within 4 days, the city had collapsed into open insurrection. The Petrograd garrison, exhausted, unfed, and politically restive after months of war-driven misery, during which it had been used as a holding pen for replacement troops, who never wanted to be soldiers in the first place, refused to fire on the crowds when ordered. Some units fraternized with the demonstrators. Others mutinied outright. Nicholas remained at Stavka in Mogilev, 600 miles away. Alexandra remained at Tsarskoye Selo with 5 sick children. Her letters to him during the final week of the regime are some of the most painful documents in the late Romanov archive, because they reveal, page after page, the cost of 15 years of deliberate self-isolation. On February 25, she wrote that the trouble amounted to a hooligan movement. If the weather grew colder, she said, the demonstrators would all stay home. 2 days later, with the garrison openly mutinying, she still believed that General Kabalov could restore order if only Nicholas would give him the necessary authority. She kept urging firmness and dismissing the political concessions that Duma President Mikhail Rodzianko was demanding by telegram, which had escalated from a ministry of confidence to a fully responsible government answerable to the Duma. Such concessions, she had told Nicholas 100 times in writing, counted as sin. Nicholas hesitated. He shared her ideology and her instinct for autocratic stubbornness. Years of her letters, however, had calibrated him toward the position that compromise meant betrayal, and that calibration now operated without supervision. By the time he finally consented to a responsible ministry on March 1, the question had passed out of his hands. The Duma had organized a provisional committee. A Petrograd Soviet had formed in parallel. Generals at the front had concluded that the war could not be continued with Nicholas as Tsar, and they sent him their telegrams calling for his abdication. On March 2, in a railway carriage at Pskov, surrounded by his commanders and his closest political advisors, he abdicated for himself and, in a final improvisation that violated the succession law, for Alexei as well. The Romanov dynasty had reigned 3 centuries. It ended in fewer days than its founder's coronation had taken, and in a railway carriage rather than a palace, and at the hands of generals it had appointed rather than enemies it had fought. The provisional government placed Nicholas and Alexandra under arrest at Tsarskoye Selo within days. They moved to Tobolsk in Siberia in August 1917 and to Yekaterinburg the following spring. The Bolshevik coup of October 1917 rendered their survival politically intolerable. On the night of July 1617, 1918, they were taken to the cellar of the Ipatiev house and shot together with their 4 daughters, their son, 3 servants, and the family doctor. Their bodies were initially abandoned, then buried in haste, then exhumed and reburied in deeper pits, then exhumed again in 1991 and 2007, and identified by DNA analysis. Alexandra reached 46 years old. Her place in the history of the revolution has been argued about ever since, by historians, biographers, royalists nostalgic for the old regime, and Soviet writers happy to use her as a moral indictment of the Romanovs. The 2 main schools run roughly as follows. The personalist school, represented in popular form by Robert Massey's Nicholas and Alexandra and Edvard Radzinski's biographies, treats the family tragedy as the fulcrum of the political tragedy. Alexei's hemophilia produces Rasputin, who produces the political crisis, which produces the revolution. Without the disease in the nursery, this argument runs, the dynasty might have weathered the war. The structural school, of which Orlando Figes is the most influential English-language exponent, treats Alexandra as an aggravating factor rather than a primary cause. The Russian autocracy, in this reading, operated as a system that could not be modernized without being destroyed. Peasant land hunger, industrial capitalism, military total war, ethnic mobilization in the borderlands, these forces would have shattered the regime regardless of who occupied the empress's bedroom. Personality, the argument runs, matters less than people think. Richard Pipes, less sympathetic to the family than Massey but more focused on personality than Fige, blames Nicholas's own political incompetence as the primary engine, while sharply condemning Alexandra's 1915 to 1917 interference as the final blow. The honest historical position lies somewhere between the schools, and it remains uncomfortable because it does not let anyone off the hook. Russia in 1917 was structurally vulnerable. A severe crisis loomed as probable, possibly inevitable, given the strains of total war on a half-modernized empire. What Alexandra did was destroying the institutions that might have allowed the regime to manage the crisis when it came. Conservative aristocrats, who had been the dynasty's natural support base for 200 years, grew alienated by her treatment of their representatives. Competent ministers and generals, who might have administered the wartime state, were purged or driven out. A moderate Duma, which might have bridged autocracy in the country, found itself insulted into hostility. The Romanov family itself, the inner circle of the regime, was driven into open opposition. By February 1917, the regime amounted to a czar in a railway carriage with no allies left to call upon, no ministry capable of governing, and no garrison willing to defend him. The crisis came, as it had always been likely to come, and no political immune system remained to fight it. Alexandra did not cause Russia's structural problems. She ensured that those problems would be answered by revolution, rather than by reform. A photograph survives from the summer of 1918. Taken at Tobolsk during the family's exile, Alexandra sits in a wicker chair on a wooden balcony, wearing a plain white dress that someone has washed too many times. Her hair has gone gray. Nicholas works somewhere nearby, chopping wood, which had become his obsession in captivity, and which he pursued with the methodical patience of a man who has nothing else to occupy his hands. She looks, in the photograph, like a tired German aunt at a provincial spa. Nothing about the image suggests an empress who had directed the appointments of prime ministers, who had been called a traitor by half a continent, who had ordered the dismissal of generals during a world war from a private chapel hung with icons. Nothing suggests the Nemka who had been hated by Petrograd or the Holy Mother who had been worshipped by Tsarskoye Selo. She looks like a woman who has decided that the world she helped to make has nothing further to say to her, and that she will read her Bible until the soldiers come. Within a year, the soldiers did come, and they led her down a flight of stairs into a basement, and they shot her along with everyone else she had spent her life trying to protect. The cruelest detail, the one that historians return to and that no theory of structural inevitability can quite absorb, is that almost everything she did out of love. She loved her husband, her son, her adopted country, her God. Real love produced real suffering, and the love saved no one. Russia killed her family, the dynasty, and the world she had been raised to inherit. The personal had become the political, and the political had become the catastrophic, and the woman in the white nurse's apron, who had once written that the rioters would all go home if only the weather turned cold, was discovering at last what a Russian winter could do.